Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Robert Inlakesh to discuss the current reality of the chaos happening in the occupation in Gaza of Palestine. Now, I want to bring it back on to discuss today a few different focal points of this conversation, but mainly the idea of the occupation and the extension, the additional aspects of the current occupation, and really the kind of impending discussion of that from Netanyahu and Donald Trump and the allowance of that from the U.S. and just what's going to be happening next. Robert's got plenty of insightful opinions on this. He's more knowledgeable on this topic than anybody else I know. So, Robert, good to have you back on the show, brother. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and thanks for having me back.
Yep, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure, brother. Seriously, I mean, there's nobody ever. I talked to a lot of people about this, and there's very few people that seem to have not only the insights, the contacts, you clearly understand this more than anybody I've ever spoken to. So it's very important, especially now as we watch this kind of tiptoe towards, I mean, what would you even call that? It's currently occupied, that legally speaking, by every legal reality that we can talk to, but I guess just the annihilation of what is left of Palestine, I guess, is the sad reality of that, right?
Yeah, well, to begin with, I appreciate the introduction. And I would say that the direction that it's heading in is that the Israelis don't have an actual answer as to what to do in Gaza. They're fighting what they call, or what Netanyahu has frequently referred to as, a 7-front war. And I think that people have to understand the war in its entirety is a regional conflict, not just localized into Gaza. And that's very important to understand when looking at this, because Israel has been attacking all of its neighbors. And it's even been threatening Jordan and Egypt as well at different junctures. But of course, its war has expanded multiple times into Lebanon. It's currently occupying more territory and seizing more land inside of Syria and bombing it frequently. Evidently, it's committed around 4,000 violations of the Lebanon ceasefire. It kidnaps people, destroys homes when people are trying to rebuild their homes in the south. It's now occupying 6 military points that it set up in southern Lebanon instead of 5 that it originally established. And it commits airstrikes and kills civilians on a near daily basis. And of course, it attacked Iran in total violation of the UN Charter, which even UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres didn't have the guts to call out as a violation of the UN Charter, nor the US attack. And in all of this, the United States and the Western allies of the Israelis and Western European allies are participants in the war. One aspect of it, as you mentioned, is in Gaza. Evidently, they are talking about an occupation plan now in the Gaza Strip, and we'll get a little bit more into that. But I don't believe that they have any end goal. They want desperately for the people in Gaza to leave. They just don't have the means of achieving it. And so they come up with all of these different strategies and operations, and each time they claim that the next operation is going to be so magnificent and it's going to free all of their captives and it's going to totally defeat Hamas, and they're going to discover something new that's miraculously hid every single time under a hospital, which doesn't exist, and they'll create a whole bunch of lies, commit war crimes, escalate their bombing campaign for a period of time. And of course, do things like starve the population. So they don't actually have an end goal. And they claim that they want and they seek this ultimate victory. They want total victory over all of their enemies, but they haven't secured total victory over anyone on any front. There is no total victory anywhere. There are a bunch of stalemates, which are going to open back up. Israel's continually aggressing. When it comes to Iran, for instance, when it comes to Lebanon, when it comes to Yemen, these are sort of lower down conflicts compared to the front in Gaza. But still, they have failed to defeat anyone. They've failed to inflict the killing blow on any of these organizations resisting them. In fact, the support for these groups and countries in the region has only grown. And they may have taken military blows for sure, but they have definitely not defeated them on an ideological front. They haven't disbanded any of these organizations or governments. And they have assassinations, terrorist plots, and the bombings of civilians and civilian infrastructure to show for it. Their policy from day one, as everyone knows, was to commit a genocide in Gaza. And the reason that they went straight to this strategy was they knew if you go into Gaza, you cannot take over Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot defeat Hamas without massive military casualties for the Israeli military.
Which you rightly predicted, by the way, which, I mean, you pointed to the precedent, the history. But before we got to this recent point, post October 7th, you were saying the same thing well before that in our interviews, that they knew that, and proving out yet again, you know. So the point I'm making, as he's making, they know this. Israel knows this now. So that factor that into the way you see their decisions playing out. Go ahead.
Well, even before October 7, and I think I made the argument perhaps on Last American Vagabond and in many other places. And I remember a few interviews I was on. I can't remember where I was speaking, where I predicted that if Hamas was going to launch any sort of an attack, it would launch pretty much very similar attack to what we saw on October 7. That would be, you know, their option if they were going to launch an all-out attack. And the Israeli response, I said at the time, it would be tens of thousands of Palestinians that would be killed. I obviously didn't know how horrendous and for how long it would go on and how dramatic it would be. And the reason why I made that sort of prediction in the event that a massive Hamas attack and an offensive would occur is because of the experience in 2014 when the Israeli military went into Gaza. They made that decision towards the end of the 51-day war, where they sent their troops into areas like Shujaiya, and they were killed on a higher scale than what they anticipated. And there were a number of attempts to kidnap soldiers, and some of them were taken, by the way. In the last round of the prisoner swaps, there was actually an Ethiopian Jewish Israeli soldier who was traded, who was there since 2014. So they know that the cost of actually trying to go after Hamas, to target them directly, to try and go and hit the tunnel infrastructure and to throw your army behind such an offensive was going to be very costly to their soldiers. And so what they did this time when they invaded, and all of the different invasions of areas of Gaza, they throw their tanks and their armored personnel carriers into an area. They've bombed it out already. They have air support. They don't even put the infantry next to their armored personnel carriers or tanks, which you would generally do, as per all of the military contacts that I speak to. And so what they've done essentially is trying to limit the death toll of their soldiers. And they'll go into an area, it's always a civilian area, take it over temporarily, set up in fortified positions, and you don't see any actual clashes. There's no footage of the Israeli military in 22 months of their invasion of Gaza. There's no footage of the Israeli military directly fighting and engaging in combat missions against Hamas. You might have one or two little videos over here. There is the exception of a few special forces operations which were carried out. But the vast majority of the fighting is not going after Hamas. That's not their missions. They go and they might clear a building and set up there. All the footage that we see from the battlefield is Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, all of the different organizations, about a dozen Palestinian armed groups there, them ambushing Israelis. It's not the Israelis on the offensive. And even some of the videos we see come out from the Israeli military is them getting ambushed and trying to respond to it. So the Israelis have not actually gone after Hamas. That's not been their strategy. If they did, the death toll amongst their soldiers would be much higher. The injury rate is enormous amongst their soldiers. And that's because they're getting hit inside of these armored personnel carriers and tanks. So there's a lot of injuries, but the death toll, which I believe they're hiding a large amount of it anyway, but the death toll is not what we would expect in such a conflict. And again, that's because they're not fighting Hamas. They're not going after Hamas. They're going after the civilian population. There's no need to destroy nearly 90% of all of the buildings in the Gaza Strip, to destroy everything, all of the universities, all of the schools, all of the mosques, all of the hospitals, all of the churches, etc., if you're going after Hamas. And still, 22 months on, we've not seen one video of a Hamas fighter using a human shield. Not a single one. Nothing. So that's their strategy. Their strategy is genocide.
And 6, if I remember correctly, on record videos, and we know there's more. It goes back before Mosquito Protocol. What's the new one? Neighbor Procedure. That was the old one. New one's Mosquito. 6 times I remember on video since October 7th where they've gotten caught using human shields. Like the worst examples, like the guy who was tied to the front of the car in middle of summer that melted his skin. This was reported publicly, even by corporate media. It's insane how obvious this all is and how contorted it is with every part of it. But so the way I call the bigger, what you started with, the greater Israel genocide is what it feels like to me. Multifaceted, multiple countries, same objective. And, even in Syria, we're watching massive ethnic cleansing. It seems to the same kind of tactics here. But so the reason that I see it this way, and what I was starting with is that, like you clearly went to, this is a genocide. This is cleansing this place of this population. So let's start with the point that we left off on in the last conversation, and which, by the way, I hope you guys will check out, because interestingly, this conversation, there's a lot in this that was really prevalent and really kind of like prescient to what was about to happen. But the main point that I like to refer to in this interview was the point of the guy we shared there in the image, the ISIS-linked gangs. That, as Robert really accurately highlighted before the GHF, was the middle group that they were already kind of relaying to grab food, sell at higher prices to manipulate the Palestinians, not Hamas, right? And now they're the ones running this, in part, this execution line, that, if you even want to call it, involving food. It's insane to me. And by the way, I have a couple clips we can play from what's her name, McCain from the World Food Program. We also have he's blurred in Israeli media, of course, but the former military veteran from the United States who's testified that they're killing and executing innocent people. It's obvious on the front of it. So before we get into the occupation and other parts of it, what have you seen since this conversation around the GHF? Give me your thoughts on it. What do you think? Is that just, the reason I even hesitate of asking whether it's their objective, it's obvious they're killing people. How can it be that obvious that they can just line people up and execute them and everyone's telling it? Do you think there's a bigger agenda around this, or is it just simple murder? What do you think?
Well, at the start, we saw that they were trying to implement this plan where Yasser Abu Shabab, you see his image in the article there. He's the head and he's linked to ISIS in the Sinai. And many members of his group also have links not only to ISIS, but other Salafist organizations, Al-Qaeda affiliates, which Hamas fought since it came into power. There's always been clashes with Al-Qaeda. And then later in 2015, a wing of ISIS was set up in the Gaza Strip, which Hamas crushed, which led to, in 2018, the official, mother organization, I suppose, of ISIS, declared war on Hamas and declared that anyone needs to pick up weapons and try and depose them. And there was even some of these militant groups, by the way, these ISIS and Al-Qaeda linked militant groups that we have evidence fired rockets from Gaza, bottle rockets and short-range bottle rockets from Gaza to which then begot an Israeli reaction where they bombed Gaza. So these groups were operating like that to draw fire on Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other Palestinian groups. And Hamas was trying to crack down on them. So there's long been, you can't say there's a document proving back then that Israel, called them up and said, fire a rocket. Mm-hmm. You can make sense of that yourself. You can draw your own conclusions as to what you believe about that and what you think that means. But when it comes now to what has just happened with this Abu Shabab group of gangsters, and they're not just ISIS-linked and Al-Qaeda-linked gangsters, they're former collaborators, they're murderers who were in the jails, because on October 7, one of the first things that Israel decided to do was bomb all of the prison facilities in Gaza. So all of the prisoners got out, and then it started coordinating with them, which meant that collaborators inside those prisons, which were imprisoned for collaborating with Israel, got out. People who were drug traffickers, like Abu Shabab, by the way, the leader, Yasser Abu Shabab, he was a drug trafficker. That's why he was in jail for trafficking drugs into Gaza for the Sinai. And then you've got people who are all sorts of petty criminals and ex-Palestinian Authority force members, which are working along with Abu Shabab and his gang. Originally, what they were last year after Israel invaded Rafah was a force that was put together by the Israelis in southern Gaza. They tried this strategy in the north, but what happened is not only Hamas and the other Palestinian group, but the local population physically expelled these people. They got rid of them, and they ran away. So they stopped it in northern Gaza, but in southern Gaza, because there's nobody in that zone where they operate in the east of Rafah, but the Israeli military, it's like a kill zone for anyone that comes in other than specifically coordinated aid trucks, which then these militants would loot. And of course, the Israeli military itself and the Abu Shabab gang. So Hamas couldn't reach them and try and, because Hamas has been tackling them, right? It's police force because it was a governing force in Gaza. It had its own police force and security apparatus before. They have been trying to go after these gangsters, but they can't reach that area because if they do, then they'll get taken out by Israeli airstrikes. So what they were since that invasion was a looting force. So they'd loot the aid trucks when they come through. They'd have to pay $4,000 to these militants per aid truck when they're coming in, and still some of it could get looted as well. So a lot of the aid organizations, and they can't say it publicly, they can't admit it because it's, complicity technically, but they didn't have a choice. It's either you've got to pay this fee or else no aid is going into Gaza. And of course, they looted the aid, brought it to these warehouses under the surveillance of Israeli drones, and then they sort of drip fed it onto the markets in Gaza, which made the food prices go through the roof, which meant that the only people that are capable of buying those goods are the people with money. And the people with the money, the majority of whom are getting a salary now, are the people that had that salary coming in from the Palestinian Authority before. And the Palestinian Authority collaborates, of course, with the Israelis and the United States. And so this system that they set up was to try and cripple Gaza and to try and get also the people to revolt, which has not worked. What happened then after Israel tore apart the ceasefire agreement is they transformed this force and they used their media as well, their media apparatus in the West. And it's fair enough to call them just straight up Israeli like foreign ministry stenographers at this point. They tried to whitewash the image of Yasser Abu Shabab. And they even recently, I forget whether it was the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, but they published an article supposedly written by Yasser Abu Shabab, where he's saying that the people are done with Hamas in Gaza and they're rising up. And the problem, as you probably know, is that Yasser Abu Shabab, not only does he not speak English, not only is he not literate in English, he's illiterate. He can't read and he can't write. That's on record in Arabic. So how he wrote an article in English, of course, he didn't write it. That's very obvious that he didn't write it. And I don't know how it's even possible unless you had somebody sitting there, writing his words, and then it's just ridiculous. But what they did is they tried to use this gang. They coordinated with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so-called their private military contractors, to coordinate the flow of aid to their aid points, where 1,800 Palestinians have been gunned down trying to reach these aid points, by the way, murdered, that thousands more have been injured.
And really quickly, but we don't have to play them. I've played them a million times. There is probably 5 or 6 net people, not even counting even IDF members who've defected and talked about this in a broad sense, or any others. But I want to say 5 people from the inside, World Food Program, multiple military people who have come out and said they're murdering people. They're literally executing people in front of us. There's also this gigantic crane that's basically automated that just fires on people for, so just people know that. Go ahead, Robert, but it's murder on the record all over the place. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no disputing it at this point. There's absolutely no disputing it. It's very obvious what's happening. And a lot of people, I interviewed a woman in Gaza last week, and one of her cousins was killed. For instance, in my extended family, I believe 2 people have been killed going to those aid points. It's a lot of people know people at this point who have been either injured or killed at these aid points. And everyone knows who's doing it. Everyone sees who's doing it. We didn't even need, the testimony and these whistleblowers to know what was happening. But unfortunately, the way that Western media frames it is, well, if a Western journalist isn't in there who works for the BBC or CNN, then we can't verify it. It's like, well, there's a video of it, multiple videos, there's eyewitnesses, there's doctors, putting that point aside, the ultimate goal here at the start was to coordinate this aid entrance. And then they were building this concentration camp in southern Gaza in the west of Rafah, between the Rafah and Khan Yunis. And they set up what's known as the Murag corridor as well to, again, bisect another area of Gaza. They've withdrawn from that now, and they realized that they couldn't operate this concentration camp. But that was ultimately the goal for some portion of time. They were actually building this concentration camp. But they sort of threw this to the side. They realized it wasn't workable, and people were not going to voluntarily go into this concentration camp, especially after they were massacred going and trying to collect aid. So that agenda collapsed, and that was part of what Israel called Operation Gideon's Chariots, which had started earlier this last year, which was supposed to be phase 2 of its war. And it was supposed to be, again, another operation which was going to defeat Hamas completely. And the Israeli media got very excited about how wonderful for them the operation was going to be. And ultimately, they killed more of their captives with bombing attacks, and they starved the population of Gaza, and they continued bombing innocent people, and they're killing around 100 people a day in Gaza now. So they haven't achieved anything. It's just more civilian slaughter at this point.
Well, so you mentioned so you're saying that the objective, so the part of the food line, assassinations were to kind of rationalize and drive them into the concentration camp. Is that what you're saying? But now they've stopped that. So that's good news. I didn't hear that. So, because originally the idea that was laid out, dutifully by the corporate media as usual, made that it was essentially that people that would go would be driven into there, and those that chose not to would be deemed combatants, which is just like U.S. policy, right out of Obama's drone program. If you're where we bomb, you're a combatant. It's like the same kind of broken logic. But so so what's the alternative? They're just saying we're not doing that anymore, or are they shifting to a different plan?
They abandoned that strategy, that specific strategy, but of course they're always coming up with more. So the so-called Gideon's Chariots operation, I say its wheels fell off. It was a complete failure. They did some small incursions. They were talking about these big invasions of areas in Gaza, and they couldn't even draw the force necessary to do it. They were talking about at one point, it started off 20,000 reserve forces we're going to call up, and then we're going to get 60,000, and now it's 50,000, and now maybe 100,000. And they're changing the numbers every single day in these reports coming from Israeli media. Ultimately, they didn't draw enough forces to actually properly invade and take over any areas. They did these small incursions into like areas in the outer skirts of cities or areas where population centers were based. A lot of the people in Gaza now are not living in the other cities. They've been pushed into areas closer to the coast, like Gaza City and in Khan Yunis, and there's some people in the Mawasi area as well, and the surrounding the Khan Yunis area. But they haven't had the power, military force on the ground to go into a lot of these areas, and ultimately, they did this big show where they did bombings. And at the time I predicted it, I was telling people like, this is exactly how it's going to go. They'll make the announcement and they'll do this bombing and all of this. And they even assassinated a prominent journalist, Hassam Shabat at the time for Al Jazeera, right before they did it as well, because it was sort of like a crushing blow, a psychological blow to the population. And now we see a very similar thing this time. They're talking again about pushing the population into certain areas, and they're talking about invading. Now they're talking about occupation, that they approved occupation. But even those leaks in the Israeli media, when we're talking about the plan to occupy Gaza, first of all, we heard they're going to occupy all of Gaza, 100% of Gaza. And then we were hearing, no, they're just going to occupy Gaza City. Of course, there's around 1 million people in Gaza City, so this is a huge thing to do. But in terms of being able to actually occupy it, all of the experts have said, and their estimates range between 2 years at least 2 years to occupy Gaza City properly, and set up an occupation there. Some say it will take 5 years to complete an occupation of the population centers in the Gaza Strip and make it into a similar model that replicates the West Bank in some way. And then others have come out and said, no, this is going to take a decade. So, and not only do you need to, take that amount of time to do something like this, Israel needs to change its military strategy completely. It means now it actually has to go after Hamas, which means a massive amount of casualties. Its public don't want the casualties anymore. After the war with Iran, the 12-day battle with Iran, the population wanted to end the war. So now suddenly you're going to have these massive casualties amongst the Israeli military. You also need to summon all of your reserves. For this mission, the Israeli military, they're putting the numbers out that they need between 200 to 250,000 soldiers to do it. Putting that aside, the reality is they need more like 300,000, which is what they had in Gaza at some point during the war. But then, your military in its totality is around 500,000 that you can actually mobilize. So what happens then if there's an offensive from the north, whether that be Lebanon or less likely Syria, but there could be something in Syria? What happens if something happens in the West Bank? It's very unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen there. It doesn't look like it right now, but Israel's always paranoid about these things. That's why it's set up an unprecedented amount of checkpoints in the West Bank. It's deployed so many soldiers. It's destroyed all the refugee camps.
Maybe it has a little bit to do with the ongoing, destruction of homes and destabilization and rape and torture, murder. But that's just me.
Yeah, just a little bit. But this is the problem that they face, though. Like they do all of these things. And they make these declarations about we're going to occupy Gaza and all of the rest of it. But, okay, you don't have the ground force capable of doing what you're saying you're going to do. Right. You're also going to need years to achieve what you're saying. And then you have to think about this, how this works logistically. The Israeli soldiers will have to operate checkpoints in between bombed out buildings in different areas where you have these mini tent cities scattered amongst bombed out buildings all over Gaza City, right? Where snipers can pop up and operate from, where somebody can lay an IED at any time, someone can shoot an RPG, and you'll never see it coming. So the checkpoints could come under fire at any time from anyone. There's an abundance of weapons still in Gaza. So your soldiers are going to be standing around at checkpoints to do what exactly in an area which is a disaster zone, where you're going to have lines set up to feed your army. You're going to have you're going to have to coordinate this. Like, you can't just put a bunch of soldiers in an area because they'll end up getting killed. So you have to cover them somehow. And then you're going to have to deal like they deal in the West Bank with Palestinians every day. But the situation is much more volatile. In the West Bank, there's infrastructure, there's vast open areas, there's roads. They have the advantageous positions to set up. And if you go there, you can see it in the way that they do it. But here we're talking about ambush city. And I just don't see them being able to do that. The Israeli soldiers themselves don't want to serve anymore. They don't want to continue fighting in Gaza because they say it themselves. If you listen to the interviews that they give to the Israeli media and their families give, they go into an area, the same area that they were in just a few months ago. They clear the same building, but except this time there's an explosive device in there and it blows the legs off of 2 of their friends, or one guy gets hit in the tank by an RPG, or somebody throws an IED into an armored personnel carrier, and they've lost, 2 or 3 more friends, right? And they don't want to continue. You've got 80,000 Israeli soldiers who are being treated for injuries. They say around 24 or 26, I can't remember, thousand of them with psychological issues. Many of them don't want to serve. And that's why I think this is, when I reacted to it, I think you mentioned earlier that I put up a tweet analyzing this. And I said, either the first option is that this is not about Gaza, this is about Lebanon, and this is about mobilizing to attack Lebanon, and it's a diversion. Or Netanyahu is just insane. Because I don't believe that they're capable of pulling off what they're talking about.
Well, you don't think that could be driven by either the necessity because they're clearly failing in a lot of different ways and the world's kind of pressing in on them, and even like the political, just the understanding of Zionism, for example, that maybe just out of desperation, they might drive that, hoping the U.S. and others step in, or maybe just because I think that they know that the U.S. will step in and back them. Like, so let me put it this way. If they did this and the U.S. and Western partners stood behind them entirely, do you not think they could still hold their own in that situation?
I don't think it matters. It doesn't matter what the Western, I mean, they've been backing them the whole time.
I mean, like boots on the ground style, though, like full on military support, because I think that's what Israel is really hoping for, like a last resort kind of thing.
Well, we heard that earlier in the year when the Trump administration first came in. I think Trump spoke about we're going to own Gaza and we're going to make it ours and all of that nonsense. And everyone I spoke to, and this was my initial reaction myself, but I'm not a military expert. So, I was like, okay, I'm assuming this, but I have to speak to some friends and contacts to make sure that I'm not just talking a whole bunch of nonsense. But my initial reaction was there's no plan in place to do this. It's a logistical nightmare to do it. You're going to lose a lot of troops. You're going to have to occupy Gaza, which is going to be extremely costly. And on top of that, where are these like some 300,000 to 500,000 soldiers? Because you need to rotate, right? Mm-hmm. Where are these soldiers coming from? How are you going to transport? How long is that going to take? What sort of strategy do you need to put together for that? And then also it's going to have massive backlash internally. And then even if you want to, we look at the worst case scenario that the U.S. military comes in, because forget the British military, it's, a police force. It's not capable of doing anything. They speak a big game, but they don't mean anything. Their intelligence services are pretty powerful, and they have, vast reaching hands. I suppose they can reach very far. And we've seen that in Syria with their puppets that they control there. But in terms of U.S. military, let's say they put the U.S. military into Gaza, 300,000 U.S. soldiers in Gaza, which again is quite ridiculous. But let's say they do it, then what? Okay, you're going to expel the population into the Sinai. That's ultimately Israel's goal, right? Mm-hmm. So then what? Where do these people go? Well, we might send them to other foreign countries. So you're going to send 2 million people or 1.8 million people all to foreign countries on coordinated flights in Egypt, which is chaotic as it is. It's like the most chaotic country you can imagine. And somehow they're going to have assembly line flights for Palestinians to go all over the world who don't want to leave.
I don't think Israel cares. I don't think Israel cares at all, which I think you probably agree with about whatever they're murdering them in real time. So then I think Israel's mindset, if we're just kind of walking through this hypothetical, would be that's somebody else's problem, right? And they know that the U.S. would likely be on the hook because they're the ones in the face of this conversation all over the place, would have to step up and do something about it. And however chaotic it would be, it's no longer Israel's problem. I guess what I'm getting at is obvious, the obvious point is that not a viable thought in a desperate move by Israel? And maybe that's it's answering the thought of maybe, why you would do this. Maybe he's crazy, but that would seem to make sense, wouldn't it? Like as a last resort, like hoping you drive that situation into reality.
If this was the case, Israel would have already ethnically cleansed Gaza, but they understand that if you do something this dramatic and this strategically stupid, what are those people who you've expelled going to do when they're in Egypt? Right. Realistically, you're not going to get them to other countries, right? You could get some of them to Jordan, for instance. Jordan might take, if it's forced, it's absolutely forced, it could take some, okay? But the majority are going to be in Egypt. You're not going to be able to get anyone to go anywhere else. I mean, already there's like 150,000 Palestinians that at the start of the genocide fled into Egypt. They haven't been able to go anywhere. They can't go anywhere. They can't do anything. They can't complete their studies. Egypt is stopping them from completing. Even Palestinians, for instance, who were in Egypt before studying. So they were outside when the genocide began. They are not allowed to get their certificates. They've stopped all, they won't grant them their certificates from university. They won't allow for them to get visas to go anywhere. People are desperate to get visas to go to different places, but they can't. And that's of the 150,000 that are already sitting there in Egypt. Is that Israel? A portion of them want to return, by the way, despite what's happened.
Really? Wow. That speaks volumes.
The question here is, And this is also what Israel knows. If you expel the entirety of the population of Gaza into the Sinai, what's going to happen? There's going to be an insurgency which arises from the Sinai. It's obvious. It's very obvious. Because a lot of those people, you have people who were part back in the day of the PLO, who went to training camps and they know how to fight. As soon as they get a weapon, they know what they're going to do, and they've lost family members. So you've got those people. You've got people, obviously, that served in all of the armed groups. And again, there's about 12 different armed groups that are operating in Gaza right now. A lot of people have military experience, and it's not hard as well to fight when it comes to these light weapons. You can do something. A lot of people do lone wolf attacks in the West Bank all the time. They don't necessarily have great military training. But then you've got people with the know-how, people with the connections to places like Yemen and Lebanon and Iran, who are then sitting there in the Sinai. You cannot manage 2 million people sitting in the Sinai if you're the Egyptian regime. You can't do it. Then the problem also, this is an additional thing, but it's not the most overwhelming thing, is the Egyptian population and what they'll do in that case and what pressure that will put on them. Egypt is on the verge of civil unrest, and we've seen these sporadic protests, all sorts of things like police violence and different. The infrastructure of the country is collapsing. The economy is on the down. So we're looking at a situation where Egypt, if that collapses, and then you've got 2 million Palestinians from Gaza heavily traumatized inside the Sinai, it's obvious what's going to happen, except now they have access from Egypt, and they have access perhaps to all sorts of weapons that could flood into them in the case that the Egyptian regime weakens or collapses. It goes into a state of civil war. The weapons will flow to whatever group wants to take them. So that is a doomsday scenario for Israel, because now you've taken all of these armed groups, and there's about at least 80,000 people, fighters there, and a lot more which could take up arms as well in the right circumstances, who are there. What are these people going to do? Are they all just going to go away? Are they just not going to exist anymore? Are they going to forget what happened while they languish in the Egyptian desert? Is that what's going to happen? Or are they going to want to fight? They're obviously going to want to fight. And now they're not besieged. So the weapons can reach them now, and they can have allies, and they will get support. And so you're doing something which is, not only is it a horrendous war crime, not only does it potentially bring about the collapse of the Egyptian regime, but it also destabilizes completely your border and presents a unique security threat, the likes of which Israel is not prepared to deal with at all, along a vast border as well. That border is very big. So they know this, they understand this. And so when they talk about sending them to wherever, to Congo, or they want to send them in some cases to France or Nigeria, Uganda, or wherever else, they're talking about this because they know that they can't stay in Egypt. And the reason they can't stay in Egypt is very obvious. But again, logistically, to transport these people away is impossible. It's impossible. And then even with the Egyptians, like you say, well, it's the Egyptians' problem now. They've got to manage it. Okay, so the Egyptian army is going to have to basically assembly line shoot 2 million people who are not going to go by force to some random country with no promise of anything, no funds, no family, no ties to it whatsoever. No, they're not going to assembly line shoot 2 million people. There might be some war crimes committed by the Egyptians, but they're not going to do that. So this situation is impossible. That's why Israel has not done it. And they've threatened to do it. They want to do it, but they don't know what to do. They have no idea how to complete this, because they won't give Palestinians their rights. They won't do a ceasefire. Netanyahu knows his government collapses if they do that, but they don't have an answer. And the same comes in Lebanon. A desperate attempt to try and get the government and the army in Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah. But you're disarming a force which is more powerful, way more powerful than the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army is 50% Shia, which is what Hezbollah is. Hezbollah has 100,000 plus fighters. Just their standing force is 100,000, plus all the Palestinian militias which would step in, plus all of their Shia militias which would step in. It's ludicrous the way that they're thinking, because they cannot get rid of these problems except for accepting the rights of the people in the region, which they won't do.
And they also, like you said, they almost kind of can't do. I mean, they've clearly painted themselves into this corner, but that's almost why I keep feeling like this is the only possible outcome, because what else can they do? They're overcommitted, and so too is the United States. But what you're saying here is important to point out. This is what we were saying. You alluded right back in the beginning when the narrative started swinging around that, see, not even other Arab countries want to take them because they're so bad. It was just disgusting arguments. Clearly, as the point was made in the very beginning, like I was saying on my show, is that there's Egyptians, whether or not the government wants to care for them or not, recognizes that becomes then their issue to deal with. And that's obvious on the table. And so did everybody else. And so it's just want to point out that gross kind of argument to try to make it about who Palestinians are as people. But so what do you think then is their logical next step? Is there even something that seems like a plausible direction, or is there something that you see that they're planning? What do you think is happening next?
I think that they will keep the conflict in Gaza going on. They might launch some, sort of burst attack or something. They might do an escalated bombing campaign in Gaza and announce their occupying campaign or whatever. They'll kill, obviously, more people than usual in that campaign. It will be very intimidating. And they will then probably do some small incursions into different areas, I expect. But I think that their ultimate plan is for Lebanon right now. And they're trying to take out, they wanted to try and take out the head of the snakes, so to speak, which is the Iran, of the Iranian-led axis of resistance, as it's called in the region. And they failed. They failed to inflict that blow. I think they realized when they hit Iran that their plan was not going to collapse the Iranian government.
And the response that clearly they did not succeed. And go ahead.
They led themselves to a stalemate, and ultimately it was demonstrated that Iran can batter them if it wants to. And Israel, yes, has nuclear weapons, but Iran has the capacity to devastate them as well. And that was demonstrated. But now I think what they're trying to do is this regional push. They want to create this new corridor, which jeopardizes Iranian-Russia trade and Iran's links to the Caucasus through Azerbaijan and Armenia. The U.S. is pushing for this hard. But what they're also trying to do is they're trying to push disarmament of the Hashid al-Shabi or the PMU, the Popular Mobilization units in Iraq, which there's around 238,000 soldiers. They're the biggest militant force in the region. They want to try and disarm them through the Iraqi government. And they're doing the same in Lebanon with the Lebanese government. Obviously, the Lebanese regime is much more controlled by the United States. Joseph Aoun, who's the president, it was the ex-head of the military. He was sort of the US's pick. And then you have Nawaf Salam, who is the prime minister of Lebanon, who is just completely on the U.S. payroll at this point. I don't think there's any disputing that. He works for U.S. Interests in Lebanon, doesn't care about his country at all. He doesn't have any regard for his own people, and he's willing to take his country to civil war if that means pleasing the Americans and Israelis. And they're pushing for disarmament. Obviously, that's not going to work. The strategy is sort of, throw feces at the wall and hope that it sticks strategy. You can't disarm these groups. But then the problem is as well, they're putting this pressure on Iran right now. And Iran is rising to the occasion of the pressure. And I don't think they've fully thought through the consequences, because if they do force the Lebanese government to try and take the arms by force of Hezbollah, the Lebanese army is going to split in half. There's no groups inside Lebanon which can contest Hezbollah. Hezbollah, if it wanted to, and it could have done this a long time ago, can take over all of Lebanon.
Right.
It's very simple for it to do that. It will mean bloodshed, of course. It's not a favorable scenario, but it can do it. And so they don't have an option of actually disarming Hezbollah through force. Ultimately, if they're going to keep pushing, Hezbollah is going to be in another open conflict with Israel. There's going to be a large-scale conflict with Israel. Israel has mobilized, according to sources I have, and take these numbers with a pinch of salt, they're saying between 30 to 45,000 Israeli soldiers are in the Golan area right now. That could be as a defensive force, I don't know. But that's a considerable amount of soldiers to have placed in that area. If Israel wants to attack Lebanon, it will likely go through Syrian territory into the Bekaa. And it knows that the Syrian regime is on its payroll. Well, not
Right.
directly paid by them, but
My
it
audience knows
collaborates
well
with
what you mean. Yeah. I mean,
them. So they're not going to oppose them,
yeah.
right?
So do you think that's at least one of the logical reasons why we saw that come in Syria?
Yeah, I think that the Israelis had prepared a plot to hatch inside Syria in the event that Bashar al-Assad's government fell. I think that the operation, according to all the information I have and the sources that I speak to and used to have as well that were in Damascus, it appears like the operation that was launched from Idlib by Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, which is now the governing force of Ahmed al-Shara or Abu Muhammad al-Julani, that they wanted to take Aleppo city, and that was where they were setting up. And there's a number of signs as to what they were going to do there. But then they saw that the whole entire regime basically collapsed. So they just made the order to go to Damascus, and they took over the whole country. Right. Israel immediately triggered a plan that it had in place for a long time to bomb all of the targets that they had for the Syrian army. Inside of Syria, and they took out everything they possibly could. And then they moved inside of Syria. Their plan has been since 2013, when they started backing militant groups, including Julani's Nusra, which became the HTS afterwards, which is now, it's had a makeover. He puts on a suit instead of, wearing his military fatigues. So like they had this plan since 2013 to expand the buffer zone and to work with the Druze militias in the south of the country to sort of carve out a Druze rump state. That was one of the plans that they had. But I think that things went very quickly for them. And what they had planned was a war that was going to be between the Syrian Arab army and then the opposition, which were going to be based in Aleppo. And then this would have been a massive drain on the resources of Iran and its allies. That didn't happen. But of course, when the Syrian government fell, it stopped a certain supply route system that was going into Lebanon to supply Hezbollah. Now Hezbollah is still getting arms because the Syrian government doesn't really control the country. That's just the reality of it. There's a million, obviously this is hyperbole, there's a million different militant groups and tribal militias and, just local forces that command their own areas that don't trust the regime in Syria. And they don't trust these, foreign Salafists that are trying to patrol their streets. So everyone has weapons and they control their own portions of territory in Syria. No one wants the Syrian so-called authorities, which disbanded the Syrian Arab army, which disbanded the intelligence forces, and then just flooded that with untrained people who are a bunch of, militants who probably most of them started, let's be honest, as child soldiers. And are a lot of them from foreign countries. Like one of the most loyal groups to Julani, the president of Syria today, are the Uyghur fighters from China. So the situation in Syria is so chaotic. Israel wants to weaponize, the minority communities, and it doesn't care that they get massacred in the midst of this. Whatever serves their agenda and their plan, they don't care what happens to the Kurds, what happens to the Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, any other group. Well, they couldn't give a damn.
This seems to be the common historical, precedent here. The U.S. and Israel and plenty of other Western actors continue to fund like the most radical elements simply because they're more easily pliable to their agendas, and they don't care about the consequences. They don't care about the issue that causes for the average people that live in these countries, and that's everywhere you look. I mean, even expanding to ISIS and Al Qaeda itself. Like the reality of the funding and the influence. It's just insane to see how obvious that is. But so we're talking about, so the plan of the concentration camp part of it, you said was no longer there, but they are still about to actually step in and occupy beyond the, virtual border occupation, the actual ground. Is that still what you think is happening? That they're about to go that far, at least in Gaza City?
They're talking about implementing that. But again, in reality, they're talking about occupying, we're going to occupy this and that and the other. They occupy about 80% of Gaza at the very least already. They're there. You
So,
know,
so what's the next step then? What do you think they're doing inside of Gaza?
I think they'll do some different incursions. They'll be doing incursions. They'll say this is a long strategy and it's going to take a long time. And then after, a portion of time, they'll say, oh, it's very costly. We achieved a lot of objectives. And
So
now
nothing.
they'll go on to their next plan, which just prolongs the fighting more and more and more.
Okay, so really nothing new. So in that mindset, then it just seems like I get like you painted a good picture there. That it seems like they don't know what to do next, and so they're extending out the timeline, and so ultimately maybe hopes they can just starve them all to death. It's just such a sick reality they're in, and so let me ask you a question about this. You mentioned the areas, little like tent cities that they're all living in. Pretty much that's everybody, right? Pretty much everybody, aside for a few certain locations, are existing in these, right? So can you explain people out there who haven't gotten the insight, what is the life like for these people here? And what does that look like? Because this is what we're seeing. This is the extension of this. How can they survive that much longer in all this? Can you explain what it's like and what you know about these locations?
Well, it gets better and worse at different periods, depending upon where the people are living. And I can't speak on obviously their behalfs, but you don't have clean water. That's one thing. You have to go and walk and seek clean water. Most people are not going to get fully clean water. They're still drinking contaminated water, even though they get water that's deemed drinkable. It's still contaminated. And a long time it had been 97% of the water supply in Gaza had for long been contaminated. So there was not, on a vast scale, most Gazans were not drinking clean water before October 7th. Which is something that's often forgotten. But now we're talking about people who are living in tents. So we've had the mass spread of different diseases and infections that has occurred inside the Gaza Strip. You can imagine people are getting all sorts of different skin rashes and diseases, people suffering from diarrhea, people suffering from different infections. Pretty much everyone has got sick from some sort of infection or disease at some point. Sanitary supplies and equipment, especially for women, you could imagine, even being able to properly wash your hands and stay clean. Hygiene is very difficult in Gaza. The amount of food that you have access to is basically nothing. We're talking about people that every single morning have to get up and their first thought in their head is like, okay, how do I get a meal for today? Mm-hmm. That is the thought for a lot of people in Gaza, a lot of people that I've interviewed. Again, I just interviewed a woman in Gaza last week who said that they starved for 5 days because there was a lack of food that was available at the market. They have some money. They have a fundraiser that they've been bringing in. Another thing is with these fundraisers, the banks, when the money is coming out, take a massive commission off of it as well. And they say that this is to do with, the circulation of currency, but they take a massive commission out of whatever is getting in. So the people with whatever money they have, if they have access to the funds, then go and try and purchase. Her family, they left it too late, and then there was just no food for 5 days, and they couldn't eat for 5 days. And this is a common experience in Gaza, that when the food comes, dries out, and there's not much there, you had to eat all sorts of things. I recently made a documentary. It took a little while to come out. Abu Bakr Abed, who it's about, he's a journalist in Gaza. He left earlier in the year. He was evacuated because of health issues, and he had the opportunity to leave, so he did. But in that documentary, he spoke about how his family had to eat pet food, cans of pet food, at one point. So the food goes up and down. This was before the 80 days of no food coming into Gaza at all. This was before that people were eating literally food like dog food that they were putting, just to survive, to have some calories. So it depends upon whether you have money to buy from the markets. It depends upon whether the markets near you actually have food and you have access to that. It depends upon whether you can get to the aid points. Again, if you're going to go to the aid points, you can be gunned down. Everyone knows that. There's a good chance that you'll die if you go to the aid points to get flour, for instance, for your family. The aid drops, you want to go to a point where the aid drops are coming. It's extremely dangerous, I think it's, I heard that like 7 of these aid drops equals 1 truck of aid. So it's just it's a performance-based endeavor for these countries doing it. And they'll drop on tents and kill children, or they'll drop on people waiting there for aid and kill them. That you're talking about a situation where sewage runs through the streets. No proper sanitary goods are coming in. Medical supplies are non-existent in many areas. If they are existent, they're in very, very short supply. So if you get injured, even if you say you're walking along and there's rubble from a building and you cut your leg, okay, like there's going to be no anesthetic. There's nothing to treat your wounds properly. You could get an infection. You could die from that, you know? So the situation there is like post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie, you know, a situation that you could sort of compare it to. And it's unimaginable what the people go there for every single day, let alone when there's no food at all and they have to starve. But you can imagine the pressures on the people there. And despite all of this, they have not turned on their resistance. The vast majority of them, when they're polled, say that they do not want to leave. They do not want to leave. There is a portion of them that do, but the vast majority say, no, we want to stay here. And we're talking about the Israelis are going, well, we're going to do this and do that with them. They're not just pawns that you can move.
Right.
Even when they're struggling, they're suffering, and they lost so much, they still stay steadfast and they still want to remain there on their land. And we saw that. When the ceasefire happened earlier this year, the people returned to the north. They went. Right. And that's why there's 1 million people there in Gaza City, because they returned. They're going, I'll live next to my bombed out home. I don't care. I'll even not have as much food. I want to live here. I want to stay here.
The resilience is astounding. It's inspiring. You know, the idea that it's just that people can learn from what it means to truly fight for something. You know, it's not even words to describe what's happening. It's insane and how obvious it is, and it keeps continuing. You know, one of the things the Green Beret whistleblower who has been on Tucker, you know, he's talked about all this. One thing he pointed out that I didn't know, well, I mean, I think I did, but I didn't put it together, is that not only, as you pointed out, do they, even before 97% unclean water, now it's exponentially worse. But the point is that everything they're giving them, which I doubt for a second is absolutely by design, it requires water to make. Right. And so you're giving them things that, you know, they can't even consume in most cases. But if they do, it's by biting through, you know, I mean, it's so grotesque that not just are they putting them through this, but they're torturing them every moment they can. And then not only that, they post videos and laugh about it. You know, and then we're stuck here trying to be objective, and, you know, which we should be. It matters to be accurate about this, not fall into one of the problems I think everywhere in politics today, even just from something I was talking about this morning, is that people have this mindset that somehow it's okay to do the wrong thing because they did it first. And it's such a childish, broken mentality in the world, but it's driving a lot of the things we see today. But, you know, let's end. What there's so many people out there that want to do something. And even myself, I'm very hesitant about I see things circulating that, you know, donate here. So I don't know what that is and where that goes. You know, is there somewhere you can direct people who want to help that you know is accurate, and, you know, or just actions they can take? What do you suggest somebody out there does right now that wants to help but doesn't know how?
Well, in terms of helping, there are people that you can confirm that their campaigns are genuine. You can speak to them. You can ask them for confirmation that their campaigns are genuine, and you know, and there's means of donating that way. But even, you know, some of that money, it takes time to get to people, and it's difficult. But I would not discourage people if you can find people, you know, their campaign is genuine. Yes. Occasionally, I have people contact me in Gaza, like verify with their IDs and everything to make sure it's all genuine. It's coming from, and I'll share it on my Twitter. Yeah. And there's many other people. It's not just people. Don't just trust people coming from me. Go and trust those people yourself. Communicate to them. They'll be happy to speak to you. There's many people in Gaza running these campaigns. So there are ways to donate to individuals, of course. There's things to, you know, watch out for. Obviously, people are trying to capitalize. There's aid organizations that even, you know, not all of it's getting to Gaza. It might go to other zones or whatever. I'm not going to discourage people or tell anyone what to do with their money. Evidently, it's very difficult to help people there. If you can find a secure way of doing it, absolutely go for it. But I'm not going to try and tell people where to put their money. Just because I don't want anyone to get tricked by anything. Or
it's also pretty wise with what's going on, let's say in the UK, for example, regardless of how legitimately these are people suffering, you might get framed as a terrorist, which is absolutely disgusting. But aside from the financial part of it, what do you suggest somebody do out there that wants to help?
Obviously, that you can boycott is really good. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the number one thing that you can do over here. You can pressure your government. You can take these sort of symbolic actions. I mean, look at what the action that, let's say, Palestine Action Paris is now doing in France and stuff like that. Palestine Action in the UK was prescribed a terrorist organization, but Palestine Action France is real and it's doing things. They're trying to shut down weapons factories. They're trying to stop the flow of weapons. We see people, port workers, right? Unions that come together and they say, no, we refuse. That's happened in Morocco. That's happened in Spain. That's happened in Italy, I believe, in Greece. So you can physically, if you're working in the docks and you know a ship is coming in with missiles and it's going to dock there, refuse. Refuse, because that's the only way that you can help is you can stop those weapons from going with your own hands. And take these actions and launch strikes and do what the port workers in Morocco did. Of course, the regime might still, fly those weapons over, but at least then you're taking a step.
Right.
But, look, we're very, very limited in what we can do because the governments don't listen to us.
No.
But, it does make an impact. And, when you see these acts of solidarity, you see people, struggling and putting it all on the line. We saw what was happening in the universities with the encampments. We saw what was happening with, unions. We saw what's happening with the activist work of trying to shut down weapons factories. These things do mean something. They are meaningful. They do represent a shift. And ultimately, as well, when it comes to electing your officials, don't elect anyone that supports Israel.
Right.
You're supporting a genocidal regime. And they have nothing to do. They're not working in the interests of the American people, the British people, or anybody else. They're working in their own interests, lining their pockets. And hopefully when they finish their careers, in their minds, hopefully in their careers as politicians, they'll end up being put on the board of some weapons company. That's what they're doing. And that's who they're acting on behalf. They're acting upon the behalf of big corporations, and they're fueling a genocidal maniac regime of psychopaths and lunatics. So, vote for the opposite candidate of whoever's advocating for Israel. That's where you put your money where your mouth is. And this issue crosses party lines. When it comes to a genocide, it may be somebody you don't agree with on majority of the issues, but that person is there and that person is standing up to genocide. So that's the person, to go against the person who's pro-genocide.
Right.
So those are obviously steps that we can take here in the West, and also organize into groups and get together in person with people locally, try and educate, run workshops. It's always good to have that in-person contact. Mm-hmm. It might not feel like you're doing anything, but you can share an enormous amount of knowledge. There will be people in the local community who are perhaps Palestinians. They know a lot more and they can educate. So there's a lot you can do in terms of locally. And then if you build up that power as a local group, you can exert some pressure, and these small little moves do actually mean something. But obviously, the real battle is on the ground. The real warriors are going to be the people in Gaza or the people in Lebanon if Israel invades again. The battle is on the ground, but all the population can do, it does pressure governments. For instance, even though it's symbolic, the UK, France, and Australia recently all said they were going to recognize Palestine. And that is because their populations are on their backs.
Right.
That's because they're being pressured. The media changes its tune slightly and starts reporting more factually. It's disgusting that it took the pressure to do it, but it's because of the public pressure. It's because the people are demanding it. And ultimately, yes, that doesn't work immediately, but over time these are changes which happen and change the entire system. They change discourse, what's acceptable discourse, what can get somebody elected. And then if your elected officials are all going to be pro-Palestinian, at least in the future, then that they're going to make the right decisions, or they're going to be closer to the right decisions and closer to moral positions than those in the past, even if you can't fully trust everything about those people.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I think this finishes up my point.
I'll just add to it something I've said in general. Well, it very much applies here as well. But it's right now, it's obvious to me that, and you can just take, let's say, AIPAC to make it less conspiratorial for some people that want to deny the most obvious thing in the world right now, is that the lobbying influence, right? It's clear that in many minds of, or let's just say most politicians in the West, it's not even, it's public. They recognize a benefit they gain from leaning into that. And you don't, maybe half of them probably don't even care about the real politics or the real agenda. They just recognize I can gain power by saying these things. The point is that's called opportunism, right? They'll do what they need to do to get the opportunity. So as a people, and this is a good example of the UK, right? They don't believe they don't care about, they've been fighting that tooth and nail. The reason they did it is because their population's demanding it. And they recognize there's more benefit to me. There's more opportunity to going with what they're saying than the negative I'll get by saying it from Israel, right? Give them that benefit. Even if you hate them, even if you know that they're dishonest, don't trust everything they say going forward. Question the next thing they do. But when they say the right thing, and also doubt their intention for saying it, but when they say the right thing, raise it up, right? I see Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out and calling out Israel. I don't personally don't think her intentions are true, but I said, good. She's saying the right thing. That's correct. And I think the reason she's doing it is because she's smart enough to see, one of the rare times I'll give her that, to see that people in her, in the Republican conservative side are not okay with what's going on by and large and want someone to stand up and say that's wrong. And when she did, she got a waterfall of support for it. So, you see other politicians, other smaller ones going, okay, maybe Israel's going to attack me, but maybe I can rise up in the ranks in the political field, right? They're all out there for their own benefit. So play the game back, question everything they do, right? Don't follow them, hold their feet to the fire always, but raise up what's honest and what's true, right? As Robert's saying, this momentum is already there. It will continue if we can finally do that, but we'll fight against the team sport politics, but I think we're winning the day right now. So thank you for being here and continuing to inform everybody about what's actually going on. Anything else you want to leave us with before we, final thoughts or upcoming events or anything you want to shout out?
I'd just like to make mention of Anas Sharif, who was murdered yesterday, an Al Jazeera journalist who was perhaps the most prominent Palestinian journalist reporting in the Arabic language. So I'd like to make mention of him. The Israelis, of course, made up a litany of lies about him in order to try and justify his murder. But ultimately, he was a courageous journalist, and he provided us all valuable insight from on the ground in Gaza. And he will go down as one of the legends of journalism. He's one of the bravest journalists and best journalists, most hardworking that we've ever seen. He never stopped for 22 months of genocide, and he was offered to leave Gaza towards the end, and he said no, that he'd rather stay with his people. And now both of his children will grow up without a father. His wife will go, obviously, without her husband. His family will grieve and suffer. But the work that he did was so incredibly valuable, so incredibly important. And the nonsense Israeli propaganda for their war crime, it's every single time, everything they do, they never take accountability. They've always got a stupid excuse, which again shows how much they're violating international law when they're posting stupid photos. Oh, well, he took a photo with Ismail Haniya or Yahya Sinwar or something. That doesn't make someone a legitimate target to blow them up with a missile along with their entire media crew because you accuse them of taking photos or favoring a group. That is a violation of international law. That's a war crime. And the work that he did will remain immortal, what he did. So I think it's worth mentioning him and what he contributed. These are the real journalists. There's around 240, almost 240 murdered in Gaza. These are the best journalists on the planet. These are the voices that brought to us the voice of the Palestinian people during a genocide, and they knew what they were sacrificing by continuing to report, but they did so bravely and valiantly, and they never gave up. So these people need to be commemorated, and these people their life needs to be celebrated, and then also they need to inspire others to do better. And of course, if you're a journalist that you're watching this, you're not a journalist unless you stand with the journalists of Gaza. You don't get to have that title. You don't get to share that title. You're a propagandist and a stenographer. That's all you are. So that's what I'd like to say about that.
Couldn't agree more. And for the podcast, what I was showing on screen is the reality that what Robert was referencing is the continual, I mean, almost continually more ridiculous, day by day, more flimsy, more pathetic is a fake telegram in, a picture of a fake telegram. They don't even understand, like they could have taken half a second to look at what Telegram actually looks like. It's just embarrassing. And this is all to rationalize for the minds of people that would have already agreed with them in the first place. Most people out there are very aware of the genocide going on. And it's like this game I don't even know how to frame it, but they're lying about this to execute people. And I agree with you, Robert. I think that these people are heroes to be out there knowing. I mean, think about what that takes. To go out there every day knowing that they're not just you could die like any other journalist in the middle of a war, but that they're aiming for you, that they're trying, and they'll kill your family. This is I think the way you said it is exactly right. So thank you for making sure that people understand that and for fighting for this, man. So thank you. And everybody out there, as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.